You're still sitting here? I assumed security removed you hours ago. Sloane Whitaker stopped in front of the man who had waited nearly 8 hours in the lobby, taking in the worn charcoal suit and the scuffed shoes with open contempt. Mercer Meridian hires talent. It does not shelter desperate men waiting for pity. Escort him out. He's an embarrassment to this company. Gavin Mercer rose slowly, lifted his leather briefcase, and asked one question. Has the meeting to sell Mercer Meridian started yet? The smile died on Sloane's face. Who was this man? The elevator doors on the executive floor closed on Sloane Whitaker and her directors, and the lobby of Mercer Meridian Technologies went back to the sound it had made all day. Heels on polished stone, badge readers chirping, the low hum of a building that believed it was important. Gavin Mercer was still standing where he had risen, one hand on the leather briefcase, and nobody in that room understood yet that the day had already turned. To understand what happened next, it helps to go back 9 hours to the moment the front doors slid open on a cold San Francisco morning, and a man in a worn charcoal suit walked into the company that carried his name. He came alone. No car service, no assistant, no phone pressed to his ear. His shoes were good shoes once, resoled twice, the heels gone soft on the outside edge. The briefcase was older than the building. He crossed the atrium the way a man crosses a room he has not been inside for a long time, slowly, reading it, and he stopped at the reception desk with a printed appointment letter in his hand. The receptionist, a young woman named Marla Quinn, took the letter and read the name on it. Gavin M. It was a shortened form, the kind a temp agency generates when it strips a file down for a screening interview. The position listed was Junior Operations Analyst, entry band, one of the lowest openings in the company. 9 o'clock, he said, with the operations team. Marla checked her screen, printed a visitor badge, and pointed at the row of chairs by the glass wall. Someone would come down for him. He thanked her, clipped the badge to his lapel, and sat. The first hour passed the way first hours do. He watched the badge line, the coffee cart, the 2 elevator banks, the public one on the left and the smaller one on the right with a black reader beside it that only certain cards could wake. He noticed which people used which. He noticed that nobody who used the right-hand bank ever looked at the lobby. At 10:20, a candidate in a new blue suit arrived, signed in, and was collected within 4 minutes. At 11, 2 more. By noon, Gavin had watched 6 people come in after him and go up before him. He did not move. He had come to see something, and the scene had started earlier than he expected. An assistant came down at 12:30 with a tray of coffees for the interview panel, counted the cups against a list, handed them out to the 3 candidates waiting in the second row, and walked past Gavin without slowing. At 1:15, Gavin went to the desk. He asked, without any edge in his voice, whether there had been an error in the schedule, whether the panel had been told he was there. Marla did not look up from her monitor. Important people get called when they need to be called. He said thank you and went back to his chair. He did not react. That was the thing several people would remember afterward, when they tried to reconstruct the day. He never raised his voice, never asked twice, never took out a phone to complain to anyone. He sat with the briefcase across his knees and he watched, and the building performed for him without knowing it had an audience. At 2, an older custodian named Frank Ellery came through with a floor cart. A floor manager intercepted him near the atrium fountain and told him, in a voice pitched for the room, that an investor delegation was arriving at 3 and that he needed to stay out of the lobby until it cleared. Frank apologized. He had done nothing wrong. He apologized anyway and pushed the cart back through the service door, and Gavin watched a man who had worked there for years learn again that he was scenery. At 2:40, a young employee was corrected in front of 11 people for the margins on a printed deck. Not the numbers, the margins. She stood in the middle of the floor with the pages in her hands and took it. And when the manager walked away, she went to the stairwell instead of the elevator, because the stairwell is where people go when they need 30 seconds to fix their face. At 3:15, a senior engineer with gray at his temples tried to badge into the right-hand elevator bank, and the reader flashed red. A security officer told him the executive lift was restricted for the afternoon, priority guests only. The engineer had been building the company's storage architecture for 11 years. He nodded, said no problem, and took the long way around. And all afternoon, in the smallest movements, the same lesson repeated itself. Junior staff dropped their eyes when directors passed. Voices adjusted mid-sentence depending on who entered the room. People measured each other by the cut of a jacket, by the floor number on a badge, by whether the person in front of them could do anything for them. Somewhere in the fifth hour, Gavin stopped taking notes in his head and started drawing a conclusion. Mercer Meridian had developed a rule that appeared in no handbook and was enforced more consistently than any policy the legal department had ever written. Status earns respect. Everyone else should know where they stand. He knew what that rule cost, because he had built the company specifically to reject it. There had been a warehouse in Oakland with a bad roof, and 3 people in it. Gavin, a systems engineer named Henry Shaw who slept under the test bench more nights than he admitted, and Claire Mercer, who had done the math that made the first storage array viable and the negotiating that kept the lights on. The point of the thing was never a valuation. The point was rural hospitals that lost power in storms, underfunded school districts running on generators, communities cleaning up after fires and floods with no grid to plug into. When the first project nearly died for lack of $40,000, Claire sold her car and put the money into payroll and told Gavin it was not a sacrifice, it was arithmetic. Claire died first. Henry died 14 months later in a test failure at a field site, and the company put out a statement and named a conference room after him. Gavin, who had lost his wife and then his oldest friend inside 2 years, and who had a household to hold together alone, stepped out of daily operations and did not come back. He did not, however, sell control. He kept his shares, and he kept something else. A provision written into the charter in the second year, when he and Claire and Henry still expected to be old someday. A founder could reclaim immediate operational authority if there was evidence of fraud, deliberate destruction of company value, or a transaction that caused serious harm to shareholders. It had been written as insurance against a future none of them believed in. He had trusted paper to protect what Claire built. For 6 years, that trust had gone untested. 4 days before he walked into the lobby, it broke. The message arrived at an old personal address sent from an account created that morning. There was no greeting, no signature, just one line. They're not just selling your company, they're breaking it first, so the price looks fair. Attached to it were 9 files. The sender was Caleb Foster, a mid-level financial analyst who had spent 3 weeks reconciling vendor accounts and had found a pattern he could not unsee. He had gone to his director. His director had told him the accounts were under executive review and that he should focus on his assigned scope. 2 days later, his access to the vendor ledger was narrowed. So Caleb pulled what he still had and sent it to the only name he could find who was neither above him nor beside him in the organization chart. Gavin read for 11 hours, closed session minutes with attendee lists that did not match the official calendar, Side agreements routed through advisory firms with no employees and no websites. Wire transfers stacked in the same range, month after month, each one just under the threshold that triggered a second signature. Research budgets cut in 3 successive quarters with the justification field left blank. Internal emails written by people who had clearly never imagined being read. And a draft transaction with Black Ridge Energy. Warren Pike, executive vice president, had built it. Brett Holloway, the chief financial officer, had made the numbers cooperate. Together, they had arranged to sell Mercer Meridian Technologies for roughly 40% less than what it was worth. The mechanics were not sophisticated. They were patient. Starve research for a year, and the innovation pipeline dries up on paper. Let key programs stall and forward projections fall. Do it long enough, and a company that is fundamentally sound looks like a company in decline. And a discount that would have been indefensible 18 months earlier becomes a reasonable price for a tired asset. The post-close plan was in the documents too, in a slide deck nobody had bothered to secure. The clean energy division would be shut down. Hundreds of engineers would be redundant. Community programs would be canceled. And the patent portfolio, the array architecture Henry had spent his last working years perfecting, would transfer to Black Ridge and be shelved. Not developed, shelved, so no competitor could ever build on it. Warren had a private incentive agreement that paid out on close. Brett had a senior position waiting for him at Black Ridge. What Gavin did not know, and could not learn from documents, was how far it went. 2 executives could not move a transaction of that size alone. Board members had received these packets. Somebody had approved the calendar changes. Somebody had decided which reports reached which desk. The papers told him a crime was being committed. They did not tell him how many people in that building had agreed to it and how many had simply looked away. If he walked in as the founder, announced and escorted and expected, the answer would disappear inside 40 minutes. Records would be cleaned. Stories would align. The people at the edges would discover they had always had concerns. So he did not walk in as the founder. He created a low-level interview, put a shortened name on a screening file, wore the suit he had owned for 9 years, and went into his own company as nobody. He wanted the transaction meeting. He wanted to see who rode up together and who stayed behind. And he wanted an answer to a question that had nothing to do with the fraud and everything to do with whether the company was still worth saving. How does Mercer Meridian treat a person who has nothing to offer it? After nearly 8 hours in the lobby, he had the answer. It was almost 5 when the executive floor started moving. The transaction approval meeting was set for 5 o'clock, and the participants began arriving the way they always did, in a loose cluster, talking over each other, none of them looking at the room they were crossing. Sloan Whitaker came through the middle of it. 34 years old, 3 years into the chief executive role, the youngest person ever to hold it. She had come from a consulting background, and she moved like the building belonged to her, because for 3 years everyone had told her it did. Warren Pike walked half a step behind her left shoulder, which was where he always walked, and where he had made sure everyone assumed he belonged. She saw the man in the chair. "You're still here?" Gavin answered without standing. "I had a 9 o'clock appointment." Sloan looked at her watch. It was 4:51, nearly 8 hours. Somewhere in this building, a hiring panel had let a scheduled candidate sit in the lobby from morning until the end of the business day, and not one person had come down to tell him why. She did not ask who had scheduled him. She did not ask her own staff how that had happened. Her eyes went down to the scuffed shoes, and her decision was made there. "If nobody has wanted to meet with you in 8 hours," she said, I'd take that as the answer. Two of the directors laughed. Warren smiled at the floor. Mercer Meridian doesn't hire people because they were stubborn enough to occupy a chair in our lobby. She glanced at the briefcase, the cracked leather, the corner worn pale. And the next time you want to walk into a company worth several $billion, at least try to look like you belong in it. Warren laughed out loud at that one. Gavin did not answer. He set the briefcase flat across his knees and watched her. And something in the steadiness of it made two people in her group stop smiling. Sloan turned to the security desk. "Take him out. The investor group is arriving. I don't want them seeing this." Two officers started across the floor. Gavin checked his watch. 7 hours and 51 minutes. He had watched a custodian removed for the sake of appearances, a young woman corrected in public for margins, an 11-year engineer turned away from an elevator, and a chief executive who looked at a pair of shoes and decided she had learned everything she needed to know about a human being. He had seen enough. He stood up. Has the approval meeting for the sale of Mercer Meridian to Black Ridge started yet? The lobby stopped. Not gradually, all at once, the way a room does when a sentence lands that nobody in it can explain. The Black Ridge transaction existed under a code name in the calendar system. Fewer than 20 people in the company knew it by that name. The receptionist did not know it. The security officers did not know it. Sloan knew it. Warren knew it. And the man who had been sitting in a chair since 9 in the morning had just said it out loud in the atrium. Sloan's face changed. Warren turned so fast he knocked a folder against his hip. "What did you just say?" she asked. Gavin unclipped the visitor badge and set it on the reception counter, squaring it against the edge of the marble. One of the officers stepped forward to block him. He reached into his inside pocket and took out a card. Not plastic, black metal, matte, with an authentication code etched along the lower edge and no name printed anywhere on it. Ray Sutton, the head of security, had come around the desk to manage the removal. He looked at the card. He looked at the code. He had held that job for 6 years and had never seen one issued, only described in the credential manual he had been required to read on his first day. He stepped aside. "Sir." Gavin walked past the group, past Sloan, past Warren Pike, toward the right-hand elevator bank with the black reader beside it. He held the card to the panel, and the light went green on the first pass. Behind him, in a lobby where nobody was speaking, the doors opened onto the executive floor. The waiting was over. So was the anonymity. Whatever protection there had been in being nobody, Gavin Mercer had just spent all of it. And he had spent it deliberately, because the transaction was 9 minutes from a signature, and there was no longer any version of the day where he could afford to keep watching. The executive floor smelled like new carpet and cold air. Gavin came out of the elevator and turned left without checking the signage, because the layout had been drawn on a napkin by a woman who believed conference rooms should face the water, and nobody had ever moved the walls. The transaction room was full. 12 people around the table, 2 lawyers standing, a screen showing the signature block of a document that was minutes from becoming real. Brett Holloway had a pen uncapped in his hand. The room turned as the door opened. Warren Pike came through it 3 seconds behind Gavin, breathing hard from the stairs he had taken when the elevator did not wait for him. "You don't have access to this floor," he said. "You don't have access to this room." Gavin did not argue. He walked the length of the table, past every seat, to the chair at the head that had stayed empty for 6 years because nobody had felt entitled to claim it, and nobody had been willing to remove it. He set the cracked leather briefcase down in front of it. Brett Holloway had not spoken. He was staring at Gavin's face the way a man stares at a photograph he has seen before, and then the recognition arrived all at once, and the color went out of him. He put the pen down without capping it. Marissa Cole, the general counsel, came around the table with her hand out. Gavin gave her the black card. She turned it over, read the etched code, and went to the terminal at the wall. The authentication returned 4 lines, and she read them aloud because there was no version of that moment where reading them silently would have been enough. Gavin Mercer, founder, controlling shareholder, charter authority holder. The temperature of the room changed completely. That title was the gap Warren Pike had spent a year working. The shares were real, but they had sat inside a family trust since Claire's death, and the trust instrument suspended the voting rights of an absent principal until he asserted them in person. On paper, Gavin controlled Mercer Meridian. In every meeting for 6 years, his stake had voted nothing at all, and a transaction could be walked to a signature line without him ever hearing about it. He was asserting them now. Gavin opened the briefcase. He did not make a speech. He laid documents on the table one set at a time, and he named each one as it landed. First, the valuation. The Black Ridge transaction priced Mercer Meridian at roughly 40% below its defensible value, and the comparison analysis that proved it had been prepared internally 11 months earlier and then removed from the data room. Second, the incentive. Warren Pike held a private agreement guaranteeing him an extraordinary payment on close, executed outside the compensation committee and disclosed to nobody at the table. Third, the routing. A series of payments had moved through advisory firms with no staff and no operating history. And 2 of those firms shared a registered agent with an entity Brett Holloway had formed 19 months ago. Fourth, the starvation. Internal emails in plain language in which leadership discussed cutting research allocations specifically to soften forward projections ahead of a sale process. Fifth, the silence. Certain board members had received the packets, understood what they showed, and said nothing. A director named Paul Reddick pushed his chair back and stood, folder under his arm, aiming for the door with the calm of a man who has decided he has another meeting. Gavin did not look up from the papers. "Sit down. Your name is on page 14. Reddick sat. Warren's control broke there, in front of everyone, which was the first genuinely useful thing he did that afternoon. "You abandoned this company," he said, loud enough to be heard on the other side of the glass. 6 years. You disappeared. What gives you the right to walk back in here and pass judgment on the people who actually stayed?" Gavin looked directly at him for the first time. "I left this chair when my family needed me. You stayed to sell what other people spent their lives building. Don't put those 2 things in the same sentence." He turned then, and everything in the room turned with him, toward the chief executive. Sloane Whitaker had not sat down. She was standing behind her chair with both hands on the back of it, and she had been standing there since the general counsel read the 4 lines aloud. Gavin took a single document from the briefcase and slid it across the table to her. A transaction appendix, 11 pages, with her electronic signature on the final block. She read it. He watched her read it. She reached the 3rd page and stopped, went back to the 1st, and read it again with her mouth slightly open. And everyone at that table watched a woman discover in real time that she had approved terms she had never seen. Gavin put down the rest of it. Calendar records showing the full committee session had been moved twice and reconstituted with a smaller attendance list. 2 versions of the same quarterly report, one prepared and one circulated, with the research variants edited out. A complete Black Ridge agreement dated 3 weeks before the abridged version that had been sent to her office, and the signature log, which showed her credential applied to 4 appendices within a 90-second window on an evening she had been on a flight. She looked up at Warren, not at Gavin, at Warren, who was suddenly very interested in the surface of the table. She had been running Mercer Meridian. That was the belief she had carried into every room for 3 years. What she had actually been running was the subset of information that 2 men had decided she was allowed to see. And her authority had been useful to them precisely because she never questioned how it got used. She started to speak, and Gavin cut it off before the sentence could turn into a defense. "The fact that they deceived you explains why you didn't know about the contract," he said. "It does not explain how you could look at a man sitting downstairs all day and decide his value based on the shoes he was wearing." Sloan did not answer. There was no answer available to her. Gavin took out the last folder. The Founder Emergency Reinstatement Clause, drafted in Year 2, unused for 11 years, triggerable on documented evidence of fraud or deliberate destruction of company value. The General Counsel reviewed it standing up and confirmed to the room that it was valid, enforceable, and immediate. He signed it with Claire's pen, which he had carried in that briefcase for 6 years without using. Then he set down a second stack. Termination notices, prepared, dated, and executed on the spot. Warren Pike, Brett Holloway. Every board member the evidence connected directly. Security was already in the corridor. Warren went out shouting about counsel and process and shareholder actions, and Brett Holloway went out without saying anything at all, which several people found more disturbing. By 6 o'clock, the men who had spent a year hollowing out Mercer Meridian no longer had the authority to sign for a stapler. It felt, for about 90 minutes, like a victory. It was not one. It was a midpoint, and Gavin knew the difference. He had won a room. He had not won anything else. Sloan came to the founder's office at 7 with a proposal she had written herself, on paper, by hand. Freeze the Black Ridge transaction immediately. Open an independent investigation with outside counsel reporting to nobody inside the building. Preserve every system and every account before anyone could touch them. Gavin agreed to all of it. He did not return executive authority to her, and she did not ask him to. The leak went out before 9. By the time the markets opened the following morning, the story was already 3 cycles old. Mass executive terminations at Mercer Meridian. Governance in crisis. No official statement. The stock lost 1/5 of its value in the first 2 hours and kept sliding through the afternoon. 2 banks put the company's credit facilities under review. 3 commercial partners suspended active contracts pending clarity. Suppliers who had already gone unpaid for months began demanding immediate settlement, on the entirely rational theory that a company in the news for fraud might not be a company that pays its bills. And 5 senior engineers, the people who actually knew how the storage architecture worked, began taking calls from recruiters who had smelled blood by lunchtime. Warren Pike hired counsel within 24 hours. So did Brett Holloway. And then they did the thing Gavin had not planned for, because he had spent 6 years out of public life and had forgotten how quickly a story can be built out of nothing. They went to the press. The narrative they sold was clean, simple, and almost impossible to disprove in a headline. A founder who vanished for 6 years had suddenly reappeared and purged the entire leadership team over a personal grievance, destroying 20% of shareholder value in a single day. Warren gave the lobby its own chapter. He told 2 reporters that Gavin had deliberately sat downstairs for 8 hours, engineering a humiliation he could use later as moral cover for a purge he had already decided on. In Warren's version, the waiting was not evidence of how the company treated powerless people. It was a trap set by a man who wanted to look wronged. Public opinion split, and it split badly. Half the coverage treated Gavin as an owner defending what he built. The other half treated him as an absentee shareholder having a very expensive emotional episode. Inside the building, he and Sloan kept opening drawers. What they found was worse than the transaction. The research organization had not merely been underfunded, it had been dismantled by attrition. 22 positions eliminated quietly over 4 quarters, none replaced. The headcount savings booked as efficiency. The 5 key engineers were not thinking about leaving. 2 of them had signed offers, and a third had a start date. Dozens of small suppliers, machine shops and cable fabricators, and a 2-person firmware house in Sacramento had invoices outstanding for 6, 8, in one case, 11 months. The money that should have paid them had gone out through the advisory shells. Real companies with real payrolls had been squeezed so that 2 executives could route cash into entities that existed only as a mailbox and a bank account. And several of the programs that had built the company's reputation were sitting 1 budget cycle away from cancellation. The worst of them was Project Haven. It was a backup power system for remote hospitals, designed for facilities that sat at the end of a single transmission line and lost the grid every time the weather turned. It was one of the last projects Claire had worked on directly, and her handwriting was still in the margins of the original specification, in the section on load prioritization, arguing that the surgical suites and the cold storage had to hold for 72 hours, not the 24 the model assumed. It was now 3 weeks from being shut down permanently. Gavin sat with the file open and understood something he had been avoiding since the moment he signed the reinstatement. Firing Warren and Brett removed the people who had broken the company. It repaired nothing they had broken. 9 days after the terminations, 3 things arrived within 2 hours of each other. The first came from the Treasury desk at 9:10. The larger of the 2 banks had not merely put the credit facility under review, it had frozen the emergency line entirely, citing governance instability. That line covered payroll timing, supplier settlement, and the working capital that kept field programs alive between milestones. Without it, Mercer Meridian would run short of cash for its most important obligations inside weeks. The second came from Marissa Cole at 10:40. Warren Pike had filed for emergency judicial relief, seeking a temporary order suspending Gavin's operational authority pending review. The argument was constructed with real skill. Warren did not claim the evidence was fake. He claimed the clause had been misused, that a founder with a personal motive had invoked an emergency provision to conduct an uncontrolled purge, and that the resulting damage to shareholders was itself proof that the emergency had been manufactured rather than answered. The general counsel was direct about the odds. The evidence was strong. But courts move on process, not on sympathy, and a 20% single-day decline was a fact a judge could see without any interpretation at all. If Warren won, Gavin would lose control of the company at the exact moment the company could least survive being leaderless. The third came at 11:15, and it was the one that landed. The research operations lead sent a 2-page status memo on Project Haven. The engineering team had effectively dissolved. The pilot agreement with the regional hospital network, the one that gave the system somewhere real to prove itself, expired in 19 days, and renewal required a funded development plan that no longer existed. The hardware at the test site was scheduled for decommissioning and removal. The last project that carried Claire's handwriting was going to die before Gavin could reach it. He walked down the corridor to the founder's office, the one at the corner that had been left as it was, and turned on a single lamp. The photograph was still on the wall. 3 people standing in front of a warehouse in Oakland with a bad roof, squinting into the sun. Henry Shaw with grease on his forearm. Claire, with her hair pulled back, holding a clipboard, laughing at something outside the frame. Gavin stood in front of it for a long time, and for the first time since the anonymous message arrived, He stopped thinking about Warren Pike's betrayal. He thought about his own absence. Warren had broken Mercer Meridian. That was documented and about to be litigated. But Warren had only been able to break it because there was nothing standing where a founder should have been. Gavin had grieved, and then he had kept grieving. And somewhere in those 6 years, he had made a quiet decision that a stake he never voted and a clause in the charter were sufficient protection for everything Claire built. He had trusted a document to do the work of a person. He had been wrong, and the company was paying for it. The situation, laid flat, was this. Mercer Meridian was days away from a cash problem it could not solve internally. Gavin might lose operational control within a week. The engineers who could rebuild the technology were already halfway out the door. Project Haven had 19 days. Thousands of jobs were attached to the outcome. And the meaningful part of the market had decided that the source of the chaos was not the two executives who had spent a year looting the place, but the founder who walked back in. If Mercer Meridian collapsed now, history would not record Gavin Mercer as the man who came back to save it. It would record him as the man who came back and pushed it over the edge. He sat down at the desk and took Claire's pen out of his pocket and set it on the blotter. And for the first time, he considered the option he had refused for 6 years. Sell the remainder of Mercer Meridian to another investor. Not Blackridge, but somebody credible. Somebody with a balance sheet deep enough to stabilize it immediately. If he sold, the cash problem ended overnight. Payroll was safe. The suppliers got paid. The engineers had a reason to stay. Thousands of people kept their jobs, and Warren's petition became irrelevant because there would be no operational authority left to suspend. But the mission would belong to someone else. The decision about whether a hospital in a county of 11,000 people deserved 72 hours of surgical power instead of 24 would be made by people who had never met Claire and had no reason to keep her promises. If he refused to sell, he could protect the purpose, and if he failed at it, thousands of people would pay for his principles with their livelihoods. Gavin sat in the chair Claire used to sit in a building that had spent 8 hours teaching him exactly what it had become, and understood the shape of what was in front of him. He was not simply about to lose a company. He was standing between two choices, and both of them required him to betray some part of who he was. Gavin stayed in that office until the fog came in over the bay and the lamp was the only light on the floor. And the choice did not get easier the longer he looked at it. Preserve Mercer Meridian by selling it, or put his own assets, his reputation, and what remained of his authority into the middle of the table and try to save both the company and the reason it had been built. At 2 in the morning, he capped Claire's pen and put it back in his pocket, and the decision was made in the simplest terms available to him. He had left once. The leaving had been justified, and it had also been the opening Warren Pike walked through. He was not going to leave a second time and call it protecting anyone. At 8 the next morning, he had Caleb Foster brought up to the executive floor. Caleb arrived holding his badge in his hand instead of wearing it, which told Gavin everything about what the young analyst thought was happening. He had leaked confidential material to an outside address. He had been the only name in the internal audit trail attached to those files. He had spent a week and a half waiting for the door to open, and now it had. Gavin stood up and put his hand out. You did the thing an entire floor of executives wouldn't do. You told the truth. Caleb shook his hand and did not say anything for a moment. He had prepared for a termination meeting. He had not prepared for this. Gavin told him the independent investigation would need someone who understood the vendor ledger from the inside, and that the outside counsel team would be told he was the reason there was anything to investigate. At 11, Gavin called an all-company meeting. Every site, every field office streamed live. no prepared script sent to communications in advance, which made 3 people in that department extremely unhappy. He walked onto the stage in the same worn charcoal suit Sloane Whitaker had mocked in the lobby. He did not open with money. He did not mention the share price or the credit facility or the petition Warren Pike had filed. He did not say the word shareholder. He told them that when Claire sold her car to make payroll, she wrote the check on the hood of it in the buyer's driveway, and that he had not been there because she had not told him she was doing it until it was already done. He told them Henry Shaw kept a list taped inside a cabinet in the old lab, every hospital that had ever run on Mercer Meridian hardware during an outage, updated by hand, and that the list was still in that cabinet with 61 entries on it. Then he stopped telling them about other people. I believed that owning most of this company meant I had protected it, he said. That was wrong. Warren Pike and Brett Holloway did what they did, and I'm not carrying their conduct for them. But they did it in a space that was empty, and my absence is what made it empty. That part is mine. Nobody in the auditorium moved. In 11 field offices, nobody moved either. It was the turn Gavin had been circling since the night he stood in front of the photograph. He was no longer fighting only to defeat the men who had betrayed the company. He was fighting to correct the part of the failure that belonged to him. And that was a different fight, with a different standard for winning. Then, he told them what was going to happen. The Black Ridge transaction was terminated, not paused, not renegotiated, not preserved as an option at a better price. Terminated, with notice going out that morning. An independent investigation was already underway, run by outside counsel with no relationship to the company, and the complete fraud file had been referred to federal and state authorities. There would be no internal resolution and no quiet settlement. And the funding was coming back. Project Haven first, then the hospital backup systems, then the school energy program, then the disaster recovery deployments. Every program strangled to make the balance sheet look tired was being restored to full allocation, effective immediately. To do it, Gavin committed a substantial portion of his personal assets as a bridge facility, secured against his own holdings rather than the company's. It did not make Mercer Meridian rich. It bought time. Enough runway to pay the suppliers, hold payroll, keep the pilot agreement alive, and restructure on a schedule the company chose instead of selling in a panic at a price set by whoever smelled the blood first. Anyone who wants to leave can leave with their reputation intact and a reference from me personally, he said. But if you stay, understand what we're rebuilding. We are not putting this company back together with fear. That's what we had. It's what let all of this happen. Caleb Foster stood up first, in the 4th row, alone, and stayed standing for 4 full seconds before anyone joined him. The second was Owen Duvall, the engineer with gray at his temples, who had been turned away from the executive elevator on the afternoon Gavin spent in the lobby. Then a row, then a section, then the whole auditorium, and, on the streams, offices in 11 locations standing up in front of their screens. Sloane Whitaker walked out onto the stage afterward. She had asked for the time, and Gavin had given it to her without conditions. She did not have notes. I confused coldness with competence, she said. For 3 years, I thought the sharpest person in the room was the one who wasted the least time on people. Last week, a man sat in our lobby from 9 in the morning until the end of the day, and when I finally saw him, the question I did not ask was the only one that mattered. I never asked my own staff how it had happened. I decided instead that it was his failure, because deciding that took 4 seconds, and asking would have taken longer. That isn't leadership. That's what made this company easy to steal from. She resigned as chief executive at the end of the sentence. without being asked to. Gavin did not destroy her the way Warren and Brett were being destroyed because the investigation had established a clear line. She had never been part of the financial scheme, and the evidence showed her authority had been used against her by the two men who reported to her. But she had failed at leadership in a way that had consequences for hundreds of people, and there was a price for that, and she paid it. She took a role 3 levels below the one she left, working on the culture rebuild, reporting to a committee that included 2 people she had once managed. Gavin told her privately that she could earn her way back, and that the only currency he would accept was conduct, over time, where nobody was watching. 2 months later, the shape of it was clear. The independent investigation confirmed the evidence in every material respect, and found more. 2 additional shell entities and a 3rd board member who had known since the previous spring. Warren Pike, Brett Holloway, and the directors connected to the scheme were facing civil actions from the company and criminal exposure from the referrals. They lost their positions, their board seats, and the compensation the agreements had promised them, since the incentive that was supposed to pay Warren on close had been contingent on a transaction that no longer existed. Warren's petition to suspend Gavin's authority failed. The court declined to accept that the emergency clause had been misused on the straightforward ground that the emergency it addressed had been documented before it was invoked, not after. Blackridge Energy withdrew entirely and issued a statement about the importance of counterparty integrity, which the market received with the seriousness it deserved. The suppliers were paid, all of them, including the 2-person firmware house in Sacramento that had been carrying an 11-month invoice and had taken a personal loan to make it through. 4 of the 5 key engineers stayed. The 2 with signed offers rescinded them. The 5th left for a job closer to family and sent a note saying the reason had nothing to do with the company. Project Haven restarted with 14 days left on the pilot agreement. The hospital network renewed. The hardware at the test site was never removed, and the load prioritization specification was rebuilt to the 72-hour standard Claire had argued for in the margins, because Gavin refused to sign off on the 24-hour model that had been substituted after she died. The stock did not recover immediately. It recovered slowly, the way things do when the recovery is real, and Mercer Meridian steadied. On a morning in the 3rd month, Gavin came through the front doors of the building at 8:10. He was recognized instantly now. People said good morning. 2 people who had been at that all-company meeting said it with a particular kind of directness that had not existed in the building before, and he noticed it, and it was the only metric he had ever cared about. He did not walk toward the executive elevator. He crossed the atrium, past the reception desk where Marla Quinn was checking in a delivery, past the fountain where a floor manager had once told Frank Ellery to make himself invisible for the sake of an investor delegation, and he went to the row of chairs along the glass wall. He went to the specific chair, 3rd from the left, the one where he had sat from 9 in the morning until 4:51 in the afternoon, watching a company he built teach itself that some people are worth less than others. He sat down. A young employee crossing the lobby saw him and changed direction immediately. "Mr. Mercer, can I call someone for you? Is there anything you need?" Gavin shook his head. "No, I just wanted to remember this." He sat there for a while with his hands on the briefcase, which was the same briefcase, still cracked at the corner. Frank Ellery came through with the floor cart, and Gavin said good morning to him by name. And Frank, who had worked in that building for 9 years and had never once been addressed by an executive, took a second to answer. Before he left the lobby, Gavin gave one instruction to facilities. The chair stays, not roped off, not labeled with a plaque about the founder's return, not turned into a story about a man who was underestimated and proved everyone wrong. That version was the version Warren Pike would have built, and it was the version the press had wanted, and it was not the point. It stayed because it was a working chair in a working lobby where people would keep sitting and waiting, and because everyone who ever ran a floor of that company would walk past it on the way in. The reminder was simple enough that it did not need to be written down. A person does not become worth less because they are sitting outside a door you have the authority to walk through. Gavin stood up. He straightened the same jacket that had been used to measure him, and he walked toward the executive elevator. Some months earlier, Mercer Meridian Technologies had left a man in its lobby for nearly 8 hours because everything about him said he did not belong there. Every signal the building had been trained to read said the same thing. The suit was old, the shoes were worn, the briefcase was cracked. He had no title, no escort, no one waiting for him upstairs. And the man they dismissed turned out to be the one who walked into the room where they were selling the company, ended the careers of the people betraying it, and forced everyone in that building to remember what the word leadership actually means. The lesson underneath all of it was never complicated. Power is not measured by how long you can make someone wait, or how small you can make them feel, or how many people lower their eyes when you pass. The real measure of anyone who leads is how they treat the people they are certain can do nothing for them. Status is not the same thing as dignity, and confusing the two is the most expensive mistake a person can make, because the man you find it easy to look down on today may turn out to be the one who holds you accountable for the way you treated everyone else.